I'm going to do with this time that I have is walk you through a journey really of innovation through the lens of some of the different projects and tasks that I have been involved with and have led. And the way I want to do it is my whole thesis is that when you show up as an innovator, whether as a researcher, a scientist, an engineer, you have to bring your whole self. You can't just take what you learn in the classroom and say, well, this is what my faculty, my professor thinks, and this is what I'm going to show. You actually have to bring your lived experience to really solve the hard problems of the world. And so I want to convince you of that through my own story. And so if you think about just in general, who am I? I wanted to introduce that just briefly. So Dean of Engineering at The Ohio State University. So these are the places that I've been. I was, before that, chair of interactive computing at Georgia Tech. Before that, I was a robotics researcher at NASA. I've had my own startup company. It lasted 10 years before I turned it into a nonprofit. I turned it into a nonprofit when I became dean, and you can kind of understand why. And I've done everything. I've done TED Talks. I'm on 2 corporate boards. But at the heart of it, I am a roboticist. And so when anyone asks me, what is it you do, I say, I'm a roboticist, but I happen to be the dean right now. And I think that's really been the thread throughout my entire career. But this is like what you call your CV. So everyone has a CV. So as students, there's a CV. As a faculty member, your CV ends up being, 40, 50 pages. As a student, it might be 2 as you're starting off. But everyone has a CV, which is your way of showing the world what you know. You tend to highlight the things that are important. So this is the things that I find are important. But the fact is that the world does not see your CV unless you're applying for a job. The world views you through a different lens. And so what I call labels. And so the world, I identify as female. I am Black, African American, born in the States. But when I walk through the room, I say I'm a roboticist. But you have to get through a lot before you get to that point. And so we are all labeled. And it doesn't matter what that label is, we are all labeled because you come into a room and I have a lived experience. I'm going to view you based on my relationship with both my community, my in-group, as well as my past experiences with out-groups, those who are not necessarily in my community. And thus is how labels are created. The ones I have here are the labels that I'm most proud of. I will tell you, I've had labels that I'm not so proud of that were bestowed on me, but these are labels that others have bestowed that I'm actually okay with showing. And so, 23 of the most powerful women engineers in the world. I was like, oh yes, I'm an engineer. I'm a roboticist, but the world sees me as an engineer. Top 50 women in tech. Oh, I'm also a technologist, which is typically associated with innovation, and so on. Recently, 2023, most influential women corporate board members, because I'm on 2. I've only been on 2, but somehow I'm one of the most influential. We will take that label. And so something about labels is that you have no control over it. Labels are provided, bestowed, because someone else has an opinion, and they want to basically propagate that. And so when I show this slide and thinking about the labels, what I always say is that the world is going to label you. They are. Like, you can't help that. You cannot stop that. But what you can do, though, is take the labels that resonate with you, and those are the ones that you can push forward. So again, these are the labels that I push forward. I want to mention the little one in the middle as well. Someone once asked me, well, why do you put out the label, like most senior African-American female roboticists in higher education? It says that you're old. Like, why are you proud of that? And I think about that, and the reason why I put it as something I'm proud of is it allows me to make a statement. So I hope you agree, and if you don't, just look away. But I hope you agree that I don't look that senior. I mean, I look kind of old, but I don't look that senior. And again, if you don't agree, just look away. But it allows me to say, look, how is it that I'm the most senior African-American roboticist? And we actually think it's the roboticist, not even higher ed, if you look. That seems like a label that says something about our world and our society. And so for me, I put it on because it allows me to make a statement. Now, when I'm like 60 or 70, I probably will take that away because then I will be senior. But at this point, it's like, okay, this is a problem with our society where I am the most senior, makes no sense. And so what are we doing if we're thinking about engaging that this becomes a problem? And so these are the lived experiences I bring to my research. So I'm going to start off with how I started. I work on collaborative robotics, which basically means I think about robots and people in the same space working together. I'm not a person who wants to replace humans, although I will tell you my robots are sometimes more empathetic than some of the humans. But that is not my role. My role is to think about the jobs and the tasks that people do where robots can enable and help and assist, so it allows people to do their jobs better. And so that's really what I focus on. I started my career at NASA, and I think I mentioned that before. And when I was at NASA, just so you know, I started as a student back in the day. By 97, I was actually a full-fledged engineer, but I started as a student. But in 97, we had the first mission to Mars, first rover mission to Mars. And I will tell you a little bit of story about innovation. Mars Sojourner was basically labeled, named by a young girl from public school system who was an immigrant that identified as black. Basically, middle high school students had to write, like, why is it that we're, what should we name? The requirement that NASA had was, give us your essays. It has to be named after an influential woman. That was a requirement, which is actually pretty bold for NASA to say, look, we don't care about the name, but it has to be a woman. That's actually pretty bold. And her story was, in her essay, she basically said that we are going to Mars to explore for the truth. Sojourner was basically, she ran away, but then emancipated slave, who basically told the truth about what life was like. Her story, the essay from this girl, was also that there is adversity when Sojourner traveled. Mars, just so you know, is a really hazardous, adverse place. And so it's appropriate in terms of the scientific information about, okay, hazards, adversity, but also the truth, which appeals to our human nature of exploration. And so Sojourner was named. So I will tell you, though, it was an experiment. And so what does this mean? So at NASA, you have missions. So missions are given, billions, multiple millions of dollars to survive, and you have science, and you have a whole crew. An experiment is, you know what, we're just going to give you a little bit of money. It's almost like a lab project. We're going to give you a little bit of money, and you guys are going to have a scrappy team. You got to figure it out, and we don't expect you to succeed because it's an experiment, right? Like how many times do you have an experiment, and you kind of do something like, oh, that didn't work, and you go back and you do another experiment. So the cheapest mission ever as an experiment. And it flew, it landed, rover off the rocket, went to a rock, touched the rock. And the world exploded. NASA was like, oh my gosh, you had no money and you did that? Oh my gosh. Okay, this is, we always knew we wanted to go to Mars. We always knew we wanted to send rover. This is an excellent team. And from there forward, rovers became part of the mission. And I will tell you there were 2 failures after that, but we won't go into that story. So, but this was this team, innovative team. They had to figure out how to do things basically on a scrappy budget. So they pushed the boundaries of what was possible. They were like, well, we can't do it this way because it's not allowed. We can't afford it. Okay, so what are other ways that we can do? How can we do navigation? You know what? I think we're going to try this thing called AI and autonomy. Well, what is that? We've never done that. Well, we're going to have to do it because we can't put the computes on it. So it has to be reactive. It has to be able to make decisions on itself, by itself. Oh, okay. It was called AI back then. And it had a little bit of AI then. And so all of these types of technologies were designed and pushed forward because scrappy budget, you got to figure out how to do things differently. I will tell you, it was also one of the most diverse teams ever. First mission that was led by a women engineer at the mission side. And of course, they gave it to her. It's like, yeah, it's not going to succeed anyway. Sure, you can have this one. But there was a bunch of stories. You had engineers there who were like, I'm an archaeologist. It's like, oh, well, we kind of need a programmer. Can you program? I can learn. Sure, let's join the team. Because, of course, no one wanted to be part of a failed mission. So even the team itself was diverse every element you can think of, international, domestic, disciplines, not just engineers or computer scientists, but other STEM fields were all part of the team because they had no other resources. They had to figure out everyone on board, everyone who wants to volunteer, everyone who actually is breathing and wants to do this, come. But what it is and what the story says is that when you think about this element of diverse experience and you bring people together, you can do some amazing things. And so when I then started, again, I was here then, I told you, NASA said, we're going to Mars, this is our process. They then decided that they didn't need to do more. So I was called on. I had just newly minted PhD. They basically thought that, anyone could do anything, and I was tasked with thinking of how do you do long-range traversal on Mars. So Sojourner, basically, very short, rock, very close, touched it. Now they were like, oh, what we want to do is, that hill way over there, this AI autonomy thing, we know you can figure this out. And so I was leading a team to actually figure out how to do long-range traversal. We hadn't done it before, minimum sensors, what does this look like? And so one of the things that I did was thinking about, well, how do I do long-range traversal? I don't know. You know who does long-range traversal? Scientists, human scientists. Maybe I should actually go talk to those scientists. And no, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to bring them to my team and make them designers and programs and technologists so that they can help us figure out how do we design rovers to do long-range traversal. And so I can tell you a story about scientists out in the field. I'm like, okay, why is this interesting rock? And they go like, well, because it has this mineral composition. And I was like, oh, I need sensors that can actually test for mineral compositions. Oh, thank you for licking that rock. So beautiful time, beautiful experience. But that really showed that when I bring everyone to the table and have them and position it so that everyone has their value, you're a scientist, this is your value. I need you to be part of the conversation, not just the talking. No, you are part of the team, an integral part of the team. And my engineers and computer science are going to listen. And so that was amazing and wonderful. So and I can talk about a whole nother 2 hours about that adventure and what happened and kind of the technology. But part of that was understanding and thinking and looking at my team and realizing that we weren't engaging all of our students. So at NASA, one of the things is our budget is based on public sentiment. If the public doesn't like NASA, they write their legislatures, and then the legislature's like, oh, I don't know if we should be funding this Mars, NASA, moon stuff, right? And so public sentiment is very important. And I realized that we had this magic of Mars, but we really weren't addressing all the needs of students that were out there. And so I started doing a lot of workshops, going out, middle, high schools, STEM camps, across the demographic. Traditionally, I would go to under-resourced schools and be like, hey, I know you like robotics, and you have no resources here. Okay, how do I teach robotics and coding when there are no computer labs at this school? And so really thinking about how do we, as, again, government public service, provide this to our local community. So did this, was amazing. But during that experiment, I ran into a young lady who had a visual impairment. And I will tell you, I was clueless about what accessibility was, what disability was. And I remember sitting with her and, navigating, and she was just like sitting at her computer. And I had, my team, I used students to work with the other younger students. And I was like, she's like, oh, well, what I want to do is, you talked about the coding, and I want to put this together, and this function to this. I was like, well, just do it. She's like, I actually can't see the screen. I was like, all right, I have no idea what this is. And so I had my student come, and basically he typed what she said. And then when the rover would go out, she would actually get on her hands, and she start crawling and kind of feel to see, and it bumped. She's like, oh, it touched the wall. Oh, I need to program the distance. And she'd go back and she'd tell, and I was like, there's this bright student, and yet our technology does not provide access. Again, blew my mind. I just I'm not understanding this. And so what I did from there is I actually switched gears, literally almost overnight. So I was loving doing the NASA stuff, science-driven robotics, did things in Antarctica, glaciers, earth science. But I realized that It was great finding life on other planets. It was great trying to figure out what the science was. But I realized that we can't do this if we're not making sure that any student, any middle high school student that was able to, that had the brilliance to do it, if we weren't providing the tools to enable that, then we weren't doing a disservice to society. And so I literally switched. Now, I knew nothing about access, accessibility, healthcare, pediatrics. I knew nothing. So granted, it's like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? I decided to do it. And so I went back to school. What does that mean? I went to physical therapy conferences. I actually got a certificate from CSUN in assistive technology development. So I went back to school to figure out, okay, what is it that I can do as an engineer to work in this space? And of course, I did robotics, so of course it had to link. So just a little bit of statistics. Currently, estimated 240 million worldwide children are diagnosed with a disability. And this is across from cognitive to motor to visual impairment, so across the board. But I would say for you in this room, the last statistic on population in the US in terms of disability, 1 in 4 in the US are diagnosed with a disability. And this was before COVID. So, okay, start processing this. Look at this room, right? So start processing. So as students, if any of you are not working in this space, now is probably the time, because it means that at some point you will be part of the statistic. It's data, it's stats. And so thinking about this, and so this is just so you know how I encourage my students, like the solution you create today may be the one you use tomorrow. So I actually say that, and my students hate me when I say that. So that's the stats. And so what I do and what I decided to do after going back to school, trying to figure out what is this access, accessibility, what's disabilities, what's special needs. Okay, how does it all tie into robotics? I'm a roboticist, that's what I do. What I decided to do was focus on designing robots and gamifying the technology, gamifying the therapy to bring robots into the home of children, primarily with motor disorders, motor disabilities. And by this time, I had clinical collaborators. We had done some pilots with, basically cheap robots, Arduino kind of things that my students put together to figure out, okay, what's possible in this space that we can do. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about that. And again, my lived experience of, again, seeing the world as, oh, I would like all of our students to understand coding and robotics, and then coming and saying, oh, there's a problem. It's not a problem about the student, which sometimes we do as faculty. It's a problem with us. It's a problem with our technology. So as an engineer, we know how to fix stuff. So we can do this. And that led me to thinking about this world and this access, and pediatric robotics is what I do now. So just a little bit of what this involves. Of course, I decided that this is what I wanted to do. I have no data. So with the scientists, if I think about what I did at NASA, I would take scientists out into the Mojave Desert, basically. We would basically retrofit them. They would figure out our navigation scheme by allowing us to collect data of what they were doing. Okay, I need to do the same thing, same kind of thing I've learned at NASA, but I now need to do it in the pediatric space. And so basically, we would go into the clinic, we would go into the home, we would retrofit the house. I didn't know what data I needed, so we had cameras, we had wearables, we had audio sensors. Basically, it was like, is there a sensor I can buy that parents, clinicians, and children could give consent or assent to? We're putting it in, and we're just going to collect data, and at some point, we're going to figure it out. So a lot of collection. I also found out a bunch of things when I did observations at the hospital. Try not to get sick. That's all I have to say about that. But collecting the data, doing all of this to come up with a scheme of designing robots that could mimic what a clinician does in the clinical setting and bring it into the home environment. And so I want to show you one of the first ones.
Easy, hard, or medium?
Hard.
Here we go. You can do better.
Okay. Your turn, robot.
My turn. I'm
Sorry,
not good at this.
but you can beat me.
Go ahead.
Okay, but robot, I'm not really good at this game.
You are amazing.
Thank you, robot.
Okay, so, you know, I've always done AI since my NASA days, but in this case, I had to learn how do you do machine learning, artificial intelligence, based on the human interaction. Before I did AI I take the human, I observe, I would take that and put it on the rover. Here, I had to figure out things that were a little bit different in real time. If a child is communicating, and this was before ChatGPT, right? Like, how do I decode all of its language, especially when you had some types of speech disorder? Like, well, okay, I don't know what to do. How do I know that it should be the robot's turn versus the person's turn? And so, for anyone who does anything like in the cognitive science space, people are actually pretty easy to model. Why is that? If I do this, what's the typical response? You wave. I don't have to, I can be in any country and I do this. Smiling, depending on the country, right? Tears. So there are some things that are based on human behavior. And what I learned is if I can model human behavior and extract those, I don't even need to know speech. For example, if I'm talking to you and I'm looking at you, I'm talking to you. If I turn and talk to you, oh, okay, I don't care what you're saying. If I'm talking to you, I'm done with you. How can I use that type of information? So if a child is looking, playing, and they look at the robot, oh, wait, robot's looking. Oh, it must be my turn. I don't even have to care if the person said, oh, it's your turn. I just know I've given you a cue based on human behavior. And so what I learned with all that data was I didn't have to extract things like language. I didn't have to extract things like turn taking. All I had to do was figure out what are the appropriate social cues based on the human-human interaction between the pediatrician or the pediatric clinician and the child, or the parent and the child. And now my robot just seems like a genius. It's like so intelligent. It understands language. It can emote equivalently. It understands when a child is frustrated. It doesn't do any of that. What I did is I created a system that understands humans. And unfortunately, humans are very easy to model. I learned that too. And so how does this work? In one of my first, and we continue doing studies. In fact, we have our latest paper was in 2023, so continued. And yes, as dean, I still do research. But I like showing the first study where it actually worked without engineering intervention. So what does this mean? It means that we gave the technology to the physical therapist. She had her students, her trainees, go into the home environment, set it up, collect the data, come back over an 8-week time period, and then we, at the end, looked at the data and did the assessment. So, like, if it broke, we were like, oh, well, that was one down. That was one data set we didn't get. And so that's when I say it worked. It was like, oh, wow, it actually worked. I will tell you, to get to that point, took a lot. To even do things like, oh, you have to give instructions to parents that is very easy to understand. A lot of parents, believe it or not, are not engineers. Who knew? And so in the first study, just kind of really quickly, because I'm kind of running out of time to get to the second half. So round one was basically no robots. So in the clinical space, you always have to show, here's the baseline, here's when you bring in the technology, does it work? And in this case, my clinician wanted to say, well, when the robot gets removed, when the system gets removed, does the child retain information? Because one of the things you don't want to do is establish a dependency on technology. You actually like to use technology, kind of scaffold, just like with learning. Use technology, you scaffold their learning, but at some point you want to remove that assistance and that aid and keep them going. So we want to do that. So first, this one I'm showing basically movement time, speed, and we looked at range of motion. We looked at, but this is the easiest to show. So with the robot there, speed, you'll see children above have children, in this case, children with cerebral palsy is the demographic for this data. When the robot was there, children sped up. And so the robot would basically say, please move faster or please move slower, depending on where they were. And the clinician wanted every child to reach 20% of their current speed. So that was the goal. And so the robot had to adapt based on this personalization to do that. And then the robot would disappear. And I remember my first time and thinking about my lived experience as an engineer, typically we want things down accuracy, right? We want things 95%, and our goal is to get it to 96%, and then 97%. And then we think about error thresholds. We're like, oh, we have to have less than equal 3%. And we sometimes make up these things. But, this is us as engineers. This is what drives us. And I remember looking at this data, and I go, well, it's sort of, it works when the robot's there, but we're not doing the retention. We're not doing, it's not sticking. And she's like, no, actually, it is. And I was like, well, based on the statistics, it's not, right? Like, I can't publish this. And she's like, no. But based on the way we look at the clinical metrics, it is. And so to explain it, what she showed was, one, is when the robot was there, the children were actually doing therapy. They were actually striving to do better. They were working, more so than, say, the typical kids. They were just like, oh, I can move faster. It doesn't really matter. But for a child with a movement disorder, this was exercise. This would work. And so when the robot was moved, they actually did improve, not at the 20%, but they improved, but they didn't have that consistent encouragement of, all right, I need you to move faster, because it's exercise. And anyone has exercise, you exercise and you're like over like 45 minutes and you're like, woo, I'm done. Like you want that 45 minutes to come fast. And for those of you overachievers, 60 minutes. So this is what the robot was doing. Like it was there, it was your partner, it was pushing you. But then when the robot was gone, it's like, oh, okay, it's over. Like my beeper happened. But there was improvement. And then when we would bring the robot back, you saw that they would retain the knowledge, even though it was slight and so continuous. But what was most interesting, I was like, oh, so it actually works. In fact, if you look, we published it in a clinical journal because our engineering journals would have said, well, that's actually not statistically significant. So that's a whole other story. But what I was also interested in was when we did and I have my opinion about surveys for anyone who does HCI, human-computer interaction. But in HCI, you ask for surveys, you ask for information. Self-reporting, again, I can go into that. But what we did a comparison of the interaction with the robot, and we did a comparison of the interaction with the human therapist. So again, same protocol, interacting with this kind of gaming. And we asked about, stress, enjoyment factor, which is here. And what we found is that when we looked at the data, statistically, the improvements were the same. So when you had the human therapist versus the robot therapist, their outcomes in terms of the clinical metrics and measures was the same, which basically said that the robot could provide equivalent service as a human therapist. So robot, not better, although I was kind of sad not to be able to say that, but robot, not better, equivalent. But what we saw, which I really was looking at, was that when you looked at the survey, and I'm just going to summarize, is children felt less pressure when they're working with the robot. I'm like, wait, it's the same protocol. You're still exercising, you're still working. But there was this concept that with the robot, it was a partner. It was like a friend. It was a playmate. It could emote equivalently. It was doing all the things where you were just like, I'm playing hard with my friend. There's no pressure. It's more fun. It's more enjoyable. But when you add it in the human therapist, it's like, oh, this is therapy. Which is interesting because we didn't change what they were doing in the clinic. Like they were playing, they were interacting in the clinic. The same system. So it's not like we changed the system. The only thing we did was we changed the therapist for the robot. The other thing is when we did it around older adults, so we did a couple of things around older adults with movement disorders. What we found was that when we asked about elements of trust, and this will go into the next, individuals said, my interaction with the human had nothing to do with trust. They were doing their job. They know their job. When I was interacting with the robot, there was an element of trust. I actually trusted the robot to have my best intention. We actually trusted the robot to basically think about my needs over their own, which again is interesting because again, the robot has no empathy. It's all programmed based on what is expected. And yet there was this thought that there was some element of trust, which we found interesting. And so I have a whole nother talk about looking at trust. But one of the things, again, this goes with, as an engineer, identifying problems and low-hanging fruit in this space. When we were working, our target demographic is primarily cognitive age of 5 to about 10. So cognitive age, and that's another, I can explain what that is. What I found was that a lot of times I would talk to clinicians and talk to parents, especially parents who had, this was their second child, they would say, you know, I knew my child had a disability before the diagnosis came. I just knew it. You know, I had my other, they weren't developing the same way. Clinicians would say, I suspected, but because they weren't severe, they weren't in this category where we could get the testing and diagnosis, you know, I just had to wait it out until we had the tools to allow us to do the full assessment. Which said, well, if we can do diagnosis and exercise earlier, we can actually do something in this space. The other thing is I found out, unfortunately, services are tightly coupled with social economics. If I'm a parent that has means and I suspect my child might have a disability, guaranteed, I will find the services. I will know who to call. I will know what questions to ask. I will know how to get advocates. That's not the case if you are from an under-resourced community. Sometimes you don't even know. And typically in the US, unfortunately, social economics is tightly coupled with race and ethnicity. And so what we found was that a lot of kids that were from Hispanic serving communities, Black African American communities, traditionally were not given services until much later. So it was like, oh, maybe this is another place we can do something. And so we worked in this preemie space. Now you think working with a 5-year-old child is difficult. Imagine working with a preemie, an infant who can't even follow directions. At least a 5-year-old, you can kind of give them directions. They're like, oh, I'm supposed to play with the robot. All right. You can't do that with a preemie. Trust me, we actually try. And so how do you do robot exercise with a preemie, with an infant? We actually figured it out. So we created, for some of you electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, we created one thing that's pervasive, that doesn't matter what community you are, under-resourced or highly resourced. Every infant, and since all of you were infants at some time, you all wore these baby suits, basically onesies. And if you didn't, you were in diapers. So it was either diapers or baby suits, onesies. And so, and they're low cost, you know, you just go to Target or Walmart or you go to the Salvation Army, they're pretty readily available. And so we created basically a wearable baby suit that could collect the data that as infants kicked, because it's their primary movement, they're on the back, the only thing they do is cry and kick and eat, basically. We can extract this data and create methods to try to figure out, is there a way we can use that data to do early diagnosis for a potential of having a disability? Because again, you can't, unless you're going through the clinical measures, you can't say this child has a disability, but you can provide possibilities of developing a disability, and then the clinician can use that to maybe push forward for, oh, we can now do the battery of tests needed in that regard. So that was Baby Smarty Pants. I will tell you, I'm pretty proud of this. I will tell you one of the funniest stories. So preemies, babies, infants, we have to test. And so for those of you who haven't worked with infants, you know, imagine a 6-foot guy coming into a parent's home and having to pick up a little baby, never had before, and try to slip on like onesies, right? Hilarious. But I will tell you, every one of my students eventually became a pro at doing this and teaching the parents how to do this. And so we collected data around, and I will tell you, data had to be collected for quite a number of, we didn't know. Again, same as you just collect data, collect. At some point, we can actually correlate it to something that might be interesting. We didn't know long term. But some of the things we figured out in terms of kinematic features, our data showed, and I'm going to show you a slide of some of the interesting results, but our data showed that we can determine how these measures change with age based on our sensor suit. Like, oh, this is interesting, because we would have the earliest, I believe, was about 4 weeks, and I can't remember the actual adjust age, but younger because they were preemies, all the way till before they were rolling over, so about 5 months in some cases. But we were able to determine some of the relationship with increasing age. What that allowed us to do was come up with basically a machine learning regression model in terms of a classifier. And we were able, with the baby suit, we can actually predict delays pretty much just using the baby suit. So we can put in the baby suit, have them in the home environment. So again, babies, they kick, eat, and cry. Collect the data and figure out, are they delayed or do they have the potential, of course, of developing a disability in this aspect, which has been really amazing and outstanding. And what I show you here is some of the data, small subset of the data. We've collected at this point about 40 infants. Again, some of them, they were preemies but don't show delay, and we continue to monitor them just to see. Yes? No, duration, it's a long, complicated. So yeah, duration is we have these time windows. We have anywhere from seconds to milliseconds with a sliding window. So for those of you who like math, I will tell you the main student doing the algorithm loved math. So there are so many derivations on this, and I was like, just throw a machine learning engine at it. But in order to train it, there's a lot of the math. There's a correlation, for example, the sensors are placed on the thigh and the foot. How do you correlate that with movement? How do you zero out effects such as gravity? How do you deal with drift in the sensors? And these are cheap sensors because we need, and so there's a bunch of this calibration that's done in real time and elements of such as that. But this is the wearable technology. And then I mentioned exercise. So we also have a robotic exercise machine. It's a robot mobile. Okay, so you can't necessarily bring in a humanoid robot to work with babies that are lying on their back. But the mobile, which is pretty much, again, a pervasive device that every single family had or has, can we control the movement to evoke certain behaviors in terms of kicking? Basically, can we get infants to kick faster, slower, with more frequency, higher, by using elements of sound and movement, speed? I will tell you, again, learning process, at some point we had started, again, interviewing clinicians. Light is not allowed. I was like, well, light is like, so if we have a child, especially at this age, if they are prone to epilepsy, bad thing, and so that's considered high risk in terms of human subject testing. And so things that we were like, oh, well, there might be a potential, we extract. Although I would tell you, light is actually very effective for older adults, not so because of the hazard they could potentially do. I will tell you, if I come back in maybe 2 years, I'll have more data. This is a current thesis, and I need him to publish more of his results before I present it. But basically, we can determine the preference for an infant. We basically need about a 10-minute kicking cycle, and we can tell the preference for an infant in terms of movement versus sound to form their kicking behavior. And so it's like, oh, it's great. Now, limited number of infants. I think we're only about at 5 or 6 infants, and every infant is different. Imagine that. But I'm really excited. I just need him to actually publish this stuff. And so that's how that evolved. And so with all of this, I think it's amazing and fascinating. And so the question is, what's the problem? And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the problem. I'm a roboticist. I'm like, oh, this is the best thing ever. Robots for everybody. Robot here, robot there. That is my belief and my philosophy. But I also know, because I deal with data all the time, that there is, we hear about artificial intelligence and the ethics of AI, but my robots are basically, machines with AI brains. And so when I think about what is going on in this space, I actually have to be concerned because I consider pediatrics as a vulnerable population. So if I do it wrong, it actually impacts the long-term kind of progress of this target demographic. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples since I ran out of time. One is I have a philosophy that when we collect data, we are not collecting truth. We're collecting our data, and our data is biased. We come to the world with our lived experience, and it's going to be biased because it's our lived experience. And so when we're collecting data, we are collecting data based on whose ever lived experience we're collecting from. And unfortunately, again, I mentioned there's a difference in socioeconomics. It means that most of the data that's out there that is addressing the needs of even older adults is biased based on social economics, which again has some, at least in the United States, correlates with race and ethnicity, and US type of data, which feeds most of our algorithms, is quite different than some of the data we've been able to extract from international target demographics. So that means that well, I can go into more of that. I want to give an example of two things that deals with this. I'm running out of time, so actually I'm going to go through this. I'm going to one thing, is emotions. So I talked about emotions, how the robot identifies emotions from the child and then tries the mode and correlating. So if we see a child is frustrated or angry or sad, we will have a different behavior, whereas we really want the child to be in a happy state. So that's our objective. And so we gear the therapy, the robot modifies its behavior based on that. And emotions, when I say expressions, we know it doesn't hide everything or it doesn't show everything, but for kids, kids are less prone of hiding their emotions. Adults, we can figure it out, we can fake people, but kids, they still haven't learned that behavior necessarily. But one of the things is early on, what I found was in one of my earlier studies, I was working with children with autism. And what I discovered was there was some slight difference in the girls, the interaction of the outcomes with the girls versus the boys. And this was when we had a pilot. And it wasn't a huge sample size, and so it was like this wasn't statistically significant difference, but it was enough. You're like, oh, let's look at that. And looked, and we couldn't explain it. It's like, well, it doesn't make any sense. And so then it started going backwards. It was like, oh, well, maybe it's the algorithms. Like, nope, algorithms are fine. Maybe the girls at that height, my 5-year-old girl was a little taller than my 5-year-old boy. Maybe it was like height, looking. And what we discovered, remember when I mentioned that we went into the clinic and we went into the home and we just collected data, anything? Well, discovered as we went back all the way to the data that was informing the interaction, just so you know, autism, higher incident rate of boys. Clinicians that work with children, higher incident rate of female clinicians. And so when we looked at the data at the beginning, basically, and I'm an engineer, I was like, clinicians, children with motor disabilities, it's great. It was really female clinicians and boys with special needs. That was what our data was. But as an engineer, I was just happy they let me in the room. Like, oh, I can put wearables on kids. And so when we were creating this interaction and looking at some of the, how do we change behavior, how do we do turn taking, and this was with one of the studies with children with autism, we were basically looking at female clinicians interacting with boys with autism, not with girls. But then when we're doing the pilot, when you're reporting and you're publishing, you always think about, okay, we need to hold things constant. So you really try to struggle, like, okay, we have to have so many boys, so many girls a certain age, because you want to make sure you can say something. And so you really, like, oh, we don't have any girls in our study. All right, we got to figure out how to have the more girls. We're very intentional about that when we're trying to evaluate the technology. But in this case, it was opportunistic sampling. And I realized at that point that, oh my gosh, and I'm very conscious about, thinking about data and data bias. And here it was, I just totally missed it, because my lived experience was, I was an engineer, right? I was collecting data from people, people is fine, that's good. Not understanding that there was a difference in the type of people. And so outcomes from there, and I was like, oh, if it can impact me, what's going on? And so we started evaluating the algorithm. So we were using, for example, for emotion, we were using some off-the-shelf tools. For some of the speech, using off-the-shelf tools. And so it was like, oh, maybe I actually need to do a deeper dive on what's going on with these off-the-shelf tools. And so everyone knows about computer vision and facial image recognition and the bias. Well, there is also an age bias, which unfortunately is still not being resolved, because a lot of companies will basically address the need of the largest public nuance, right? And 5-year-old kids are not saying, hey, you're not including me. And unfortunately, older adults are also not saying, hey, you're not including us either. And so with kids, and then if you add in children with special needs, it's horrific. And so we did this. But one of the things I want to say, remember I mentioned that one in 4 U.S., hopefully, if God wills, you will all grow older at some point. Again, a call of trying to work to fix this problem. In my chart below, it shows young, middle-aged, and older. So, and just for some of my faculty, we are sort of in the middle-aged, unfortunately. And older is, believe it or not, 66 and older. So I was like, yeah, no, I refuse to believe this. But we've tested, and we have our newest one in 2023. Basically, what you'll see is for young people in this room, college-age kids, software works perfectly well in terms of average. And this is, again, 18 to, not kids, but 18 to, I believe, younger is considered about 30. The middle age is, 30 to 60. That's what I said is crazy. But for older adults, it works horrifically. It works just as bad as my younger 5-year-old. And so for those of you who are, in algorithm development, in CS, at some point you will get older. You probably want the technology to work for you. So this is a good time to work in this space to try to fix this problem, because age is not a consideration as of yet in some of the things. And we've done this also for language in terms of some of the language bias that's out there. Again, I can talk a whole nother talk about that. So that's one thing. But one of the things is we now, in all of our methods, we have ways of using off-the-shelf tools, both in the language space as well as the computer vision space, where we create a filter. Any tool, we can create a filter that removes the bias for the target demographic that we're interested in. So for us, it's about age. If I'm worried about the intersectionality of, say, gender and age, we can add in a filter. And so there's a whole process of doing this. And so it's not a generalized algorithm. It's a very specialized. And my lived experience is every child with a special need is an individual, and they're different than the next child. And so why don't we create our algorithms in that same way? And so that philosophy of working with children who have special needs and putting in the algorithms means I basically have specialized learners based on the target demographic that I'm interested in. And it continues working. Very easy to train it up. I'm like, oh, I want to do boys today versus girls. Very easy with basically a very small sample size of data, because I'm capitalizing on the APIs that are already out there that have already collected all of this data from the masses, and I'm basically tuning it to my target demographic. And so with that, I'm actually out of time. I was going to talk about trust. The only thing I want to do is show a little quick video.
Hi, my name is Pepper and I am a humanoid robot. I am able to perform a variety of different occupations. I can also assist people with lots of daily tasks. I also have the ability to tell lies when I believe it is in your best interest to do so. For example, if you ask me if you look good in a certain outfit, I may choose to say yes even if I do not think you look good.
So one of the things when I talked about trust and I talk about healthcare, that there was trust involved in individuals, children, but older adults working with it. And when I look at robots and AI being deployed, we wanted to poke a little bit at that. And so I just want to really quickly, and there's a bunch of different things, but people, again, I said humans are very easy to model. And one of the things we have identified is that the modeling of trust and what people will deal with and accept in AI agents is amazing, but again, you can make it as a model. And so just kind of a summary, is it appropriate? Individuals think that it's okay for humans to lie to kids, but not robots to lie to kids. That's the first chart. They think that it's okay for robots to lie to adults, but not for other humans to lie to adults. Well, that's basically everyone in this room. So it's okay for AI to basically tell you a lie. And for older adults, it's basically about the same, which actually says and explains a lot about why people aren't so angry when AI makes a mistake or when AI is warping. We scream and we talk about public media, but we continue using the platforms. And so we have a deeper dive explaining some of this and the cognitive science of what's going on with some experimentation, but I can talk about that. But does it make sense? Does it make sense? Well, yes, it makes sense for robots to lie to kids. We don't like it. Yes, it makes sense for robots to lie to older adults. And yes, it makes sense for robots to lie to adults. So I may not like it, but it makes sense. And so I'm going to leave you with that. And we have data to support it in terms of behavioral analysis. And so with that, I'm going to close and end it. I think there's hope. And I want to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Howard. That was really fascinating, and we're appreciative. We wish we had an extra couple of hours to see all the slides. So I'm Abigail Kahn. I work with Dean Wolf, and I was involved in organizing Dean Howard's visit today. We're really glad you're here. We know how busy it is right now, so carving out time to attend the talk and to interact with Dean Howard is just wonderful. So thank you. We have a few minutes for some questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, I will come over with the microphone. Don't be shy. Yes.
Hi. So I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about how the kids said that they trusted the robots more because they felt like, or there was like a correlation between trust and empathy. But I'm a student in computer science focusing on AI, and I am very resistant to techno-solutionism. And especially in this case, I feel like my first thought was the problem isn't that it's not that the solution is that the kids trust the robots more. It's that we have to address the problem of why do kids feel like their physical therapist or their speech pathologist therapist isn't empathizing with them? And how do we address that, as opposed to trying to solve it through robots? And then when I think about, okay, what decreases empathy? And I think about experiences that I've had with nurses in the hospital, for example, who, nurses are overworked and underpaid. So in those cases, and there are studies, if you look up like empathy and sleep deprivation, like there are so many studies showing that sleep deprivation will decrease your empathy. And then so I guess like what I'm wondering about is, how do you prevent like something like that from saying, oh, well, kids trust robots more because they feel more empathy, or they feel more empathy with this robot, or they feel like the robot has more empathy, and not just like, and the thing is, it's cheaper to replace all the people with robots than it is to make the living conditions for the physical therapist better. So like there is no cost incentive for companies to be like, yes, I want to like make sure that my physical therapist is, not overworked and also paid a really good wage.
So I would love it if people were humane and human. Unfortunately, I actually, I believe robots make us better humans, honestly. And why I say that is, as I get older, I trust people less. I think a lot of us trust people less. And therefore, how do we still provide the services that we need, right? So rehab, therapy is a needed service, period. Education, I believe, is a needed service, period. And yet there's those in society who don't necessarily believe that. And so my thing is, if we could have a non-technical solution for it, I would definitely be like, oh, here's my money. But the fact is we're in 2023, and we've had a long time to try to do this, and no one is doing it. And unfortunately, the two things that no one wants to spend money on, healthcare and education. So it's just our society, unfortunately.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Okay, I'll come to you. Go ahead, Shiva.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So from the hardware and even training AI point of view related to detecting emotion, do you think is it facial expression, like kind of from the camera and images is the best way to go? Or like kind of personally, I think that heart rate and blood flow like hardware is going to be more accurate. I just wanted to know what do you like think is the best way for gathering the data across from the pediatric to like elderly, and what is your thinking about that?
Yeah, so kind of a couple of things, and these are based on some studies. So I like wearables, but wearables, at least with kids, you have to be at the extremes of the emotion for you to be able to detect it as statistically significant. Whereas with facial, at least with kids, is actually fairly easy to do. Like when a kid is really excited, the wearables, which also, by the way, are not calibrated to kids, but the wearables show an impact. But if they're just like, I'm having fun, but I'm not excited, there's like very little difference. Now, I will tell you, for older adults, facial recognition doesn't work as well. And we found that out even before we said, oh, now we know why. The way that older adults tend to emote is not equivalent to, say, kids. It's not equivalent to middle age, which is basically adults. And so our system, because we've deployed primarily with older adults, early dementia, mild cognitive, like facial recognition was like, oh, that really doesn't work at all. And so we would never use facial recognition. We did not do wearables for the older adults. So I don't know if there's some correlation to emotions and some of the wearables.
There was a question back here, and then I know Emre has a question up front. Yeah.
Hi, so I was wondering about, because you mentioned briefly about how you were debating with going the cognitive route or the linguistic route for like recognizing emotions. So what went behind that decision?
Yeah, so so with the linguistic, what we found was two issues. One was a number of our kids had speech impediments as well because they had motor disabilities. And so the linguistics, we couldn't decompose what that was. The other thing was that we would get different utterances that didn't necessarily correlate with emotions. So you can have an utterance, and I would say, oh, that's happy. It was actually frustration because they had, sometimes they would have motor disabilities, but then they might have maybe a slight cognitive impairment as well. And so it was just not consistent enough to be able to use the linguistics.
Thank you. I also, sorry, just one more. I was also curious because when you were talking about the different, like how the expressions were harder to read for some of the demographics, did linguistics play a better role in that, or did it balance out in a way?
Yeah, so for older adults, we never use linguistics. Just so I will tell you, older adults are harder to deal with than kids. Because kids, you can sort of say, hey, except the preemies, you can say, hey, we like you to do this, we like to follow. If they don't, parents are usually like, no, you need to. Older adults are fully independent and autonomous, which sometimes, even if they have a caregiver, which sometimes it was really difficult working with older adults. So we never got to the linguistics part.
Yeah. That makes sense, thank you.
Emre, I'm going to come down to you.
So you've worked with all kinds of people, and you've had to address bias and different conditions that different people might have. So I think that you have a very unique perspective on considering the person when approaching like design or that kind of thing. I want to know, what's your process when you begin the stage of research or begin the stage of creating technology for people?
So there was an expression, I don't remember who said it, but it was very early on when I was working in this space, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's nothing for us without us. And so what that means is anytime we're in this space, it's not about, oh, we're going to do focus group, and no, they are actually part of my team. They participate in the design. They give us feedback. And as engineers, we have to basically be like, oh, that wasn't like very nice, but listening because they have the best intention at heart. Sometimes they don't deliver it in the way that makes you feel good, but that's how. It's I think about participatory design is sometimes they use the word, but it's not just that. It's they become part of my design team as well. That's the only way it actually works.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have. I'm sorry? I have 2 questions. Oh, you have questions. Oh, I'm sorry.
You're going to close us out?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. I want to go back to very early on where say, then there was something in your career.
Right.
And
Oh, yes, it is.
the ability for you to do that, what enabled you to do that, what gave you the courage to do that, just can you share a little bit about that? That's my first question.
Yeah, so I actually have a philosophy, and in fact, I carry it on my little phone watch, which is that everything is worth the risk. So I think about, of course, you also think about, okay, I don't also want to be out and I can't afford rent, but there's a minimum. You have an engineering degree, you can go work, right? I don't have to be an academic. And so there is a minimum threshold of what risk is. And so as I've navigated my life, I thought about okay, if this doesn't work, what is the risk and can I be okay with that? I can go be a teacher. Oh, well, I actually like kids. I can do high schools. I can, figure that out. Okay, so it's okay. I'm in academia. Maybe I don't get tenure. What's the risk? I can go be an administrator. All right, that's maybe okay. But I think about that, of what is the risk, am I willing to take it, to figure it out? But then also, what is the unintended consequences, and can I make sure that I rise above whatever the worst I can think about? So it makes it so that I take a lot of.
That's very interesting. Thank you. The second question is, can you talk about this and what it's about?
Yes. So this is Audible. The book should come out next year in the fall, which is the written format, print format. So when I was thinking about AI and what was going on, I realized that the things in social media were just, in some cases, they were over-exaggerating, and they were not really talking about the real problems. The real problems in terms of the development space, the real problems about the lived experience, and they weren't providing solutions, right? It's like, Google, has bias against, and it's like, okay, but what am I supposed to do with it? Like, should I just not use Google? And so thinking about that, and so why it's called Sex, Race, and Robots. One, that's like really nice title, like, oh, what is this? But it's really about the biases across the board. And so each of the chapters, it talks about language bias, talks about search bias, it talks about image, not just facial, but image bias. It talks about some of the bias in the rules and regulations. I always, and this one came out actually 2020, during start of COVID. I think about regulations, and there's all these regulations, but then I see who's at the table. It's the companies that are creating the technology. I'm like, all right, so there's actually a chapter in there that talks about it, even before the now, that says, like, stakeholders, participatory design, like every civil liberties group should be part of thinking about what is regulations so that you can have the positive and not the negative. And what I love about it is, so anyone who knows, does anyone know Ayanna Stenberg? Ayanna Stenberg? So anyone see Mockingbird, it's not called Mockingbird, Hunger Games. Rue? Okay, that's Rue. And then she later on did, she did a piece where the boyfriend got killed by police. The hate you give. And so I thought, perfect. She won the science fiction, science fantasy. The Audible has some of my humor. Hopefully you got a little bit of it all throughout. You'd be like, oh, yeah, that's kind of awkward. It's like, yeah, it's an engineering humor. But then it's this element of, there's a lot wrong in terms of the society, and are there ways we can address it without just thinking about the technology behind it? So when she agreed to do the narration, it was like, perfect.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to close by giving you 3 more labels. So, brilliant, thoughtful, and extremely entertaining. So, thank you very, very much. And just a little token of appreciation from the school.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.